So in class, we took notes on the characteristics of life. We've spent a while talking about biochemistry, or the chemistry of life, because we could have jumped right into talking about cells, but what exactly are cells made of is one of the questions. So now that we understand that you can take atoms and build a molecule, and you can take molecules and build something bigger, we want to start to understand how all living things are going to be categorized as living. So we took these notes in class, and these notes add up to something that we call Sternger. S-T-E-R is what you see here. Synthesis, transport, excretion, regulation. And you need to know the words that are here. So you need to know the word and the definition that we wrote in bold and underline. On the next page, you'll also see N-G-R-R, because there are 4 other characteristics. In order to be living, you have to do all 8 of these things. You have to synthesize or build something, transport or move something, excrete, which means to get rid of things, regulate, which means to control their body. And so the other 4 is nutrition, either making or consuming food, growth and development, getting bigger in a variety of ways, respiration, we're going to be really careful. I want you to put a big star by this one, because respiration is not just breathing. The reason you breathe is purposeful. You need oxygen, usually, to break down your food. And then reproduction, which is to make more offspring. Together, these Sternger reactions and processes make up an organism's metabolism. Make sure that you have circled and starred this word, which is all of your reactions. It's the building reactions and the breaking down reactions. All of that is your metabolism. Please make sure that you have done the summary box. Remember, summary boxes always use 2 vocabulary words. 2 vocabulary words, and you usually refer to a diagram, but there aren't many diagrams in this section. So you need to at least use 2 vocabulary words. So these were the notes that we took in class. But if you were absent, I wanted to make sure that they were here. You could pause the video and write them down if you needed to. We're moving on to just do a quick overview of the different types of living things. The lab that we did at the beginning of the year, where you were collecting and growing microbes, those are an example of a living thing. But most people, when they think of living things, they think of animals first, and then they think of plants. And they forget that there's a lot of other living things that you'll see in our world, in biology. So living organisms share many characteristics. If you're living, you do all 8 Sternger processes. But we can group or classify them into 6 main kingdoms. We're going to talk a lot about this word kingdom later. But for now, we're just going to say that a kingdom is the same thing as a group. It's a group of organisms that share similar characteristics. So for example, bacteria, a kingdom of simple unicellular organisms known as prokaryotes. Now you're getting a little sprinkling of words you're going to see this whole year. For example, you're going to see the prefix "u", which means true. You'll see that prefix many times throughout this year. And so eubacteria means true bacteria, because these are the bacteria we think of. Have you ever had a staph infection or a strep infection or salmonella? Those are all examples of what we call eubacteria. We have another group that's also, notice, prokaryotes. They're simple cells. And they're unicellular. But these live in really extreme environments. They live in places that are really salty, like the Dead Sea. And we know the effect that salt can have on your enzymes. Remember, salt can denature your enzymes. So the organisms that live in the Dead Sea, they have a way to protect themselves from that salt. They can live in very acidic places. They can live in very hot or cold places. And so these are bacteria that are considered extremophiles. They love extreme environments. We have another group that are called protists. And you'll notice these are complex cells with a nucleus. Now maybe you've learned what a nucleus is in one of your classes before this. A nucleus is where a cell can hold its DNA if it's a complex cell. These two cells don't have that. These can include algae and things like a brain-eating amoeba. And so some are unicellular, some are multicellular. What you see here is a picture that gives you a general idea of the 6 kingdoms. As I said, most people know plants and animals. You might think of fungi, but protists, eubacteria, and archaeobacteria aren't the first things that come to most people's minds. So we're trying to introduce ourselves to these because what we want to understand is all of these are made of cells, which means they have a cell membrane made of phospholipids, which means that they break down sugar to get energy using the process respiration, which means that they reproduce, they synthesize, they transport, they excrete, they regulate, they get nutrition, they grow, they reproduce, and they use respiration. And so what we can see is that all life has those things in common, but we will start to split them up a little bit. And so those are the kingdoms that you're probably going to have to study the most this year because they're the most unfamiliar to you. The other 3 are kingdoms that you're really going to recognize. We have Plantae, which is the Latin word for plants, a kingdom of complex multicellular organisms who make their own food. Now, if you're getting food, remember that's an example of nutrition. And if you're making something, that's an example of our Sterngr word that starts with an S. Can you finish what that word is? Take a second to practice what Sterngr word means to make. And so we know plants. We take them for granted, but we know usually that plants are living. We have to be a little careful because some people think that mushrooms are plants just because they grow on the ground. But they are very different because they consume food. They don't make food using energy from the sun. They consume their food. It doesn't just include mushrooms, it also includes molds and yeasts. So this year we're going to do a yeast lab, and we're going to be working with a fungus. And then we have kingdom Animalia, also the Latin word. These are complex organisms that move and consume food. So those are your 6 kingdoms of life. But there's one group, they're not really organisms. Put quotation marks around organisms. Viruses. Viruses don't even have cells, and they can't do Sterngr on their own. So they don't really perform any of the life functions on their own. Some people say, well, they infect me and they can spread from person to person. Does that make them living? So for right now, they don't fit into a kingdom. We are going to talk about viruses later, but for now, things like HIV and the rhinovirus and the influenza virus, they don't belong in any of the kingdoms. What you're going to see at the bottom here is another summary box. And so remember, in these summary boxes, you always want to use 2 vocabulary words. So maybe you want to use the word kingdom. That might be a good word to use to describe the notes that you just took. This is a short section, and so you do maybe want to go ahead and work on your apps, which are on page 19, because that will help you practice both your Sterngr and your kingdoms. For now, that's the end of this video. A short one for you today.